Morning, everyone. This is Dr. Namani and Dr. Louie back here today with the Athlete's Mind. We're really excited to have Sam Watson here today with us, who is a recent bronze medalist at the Paris Olympics. And he is involved in a sport that a lot of you may not know about, but is really exciting and possibly one of the fastest sports in the world, which is speed climbing. So, Sam, welcome and thanks for coming on with us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess my first question to you is tell us a little bit about speed climbing. Like what goes into the training? What got you interested in it? Tell us about the sport a little bit.
So speed climbing is the process of doing a standardized 15-meter route that is the same all over the world, and it's homologated, meaning that it's made to be the same every time. So world records can be set on it. And so
Oh,
I hold the world record at 4.74 seconds over 15 meters to do so. I would say it's definitely one of the lowest margin of error sports in the Olympics. It's 30 movements at max speed to try and to hit every single one as accurate as possible, and to get to the top of the wall doing that. So quite difficult there. One beautiful thing about my sport is it is relatively safe in terms of injuries because of the process of you climb this wall and you are on a rope or an auto belay that retracts automatically. And when you fall, it just catches you and you can kind of float down to the ground. So there's maybe in some other types of climbing, like lead climbing, in which you're on a rope that's a little bit more variable. You could maybe hit the ground. Or if you're bouldering, you're on a mat. And there's, if you do a certain kind of weird move, you could potentially hurt your like wrists, back, neck, all types of things. But in speed climbing, you're generally pretty safe as far as major injuries go. Of course, maybe the stuff like finger injuries, foot injuries, things like turf toe, pulleys, tendonitis can be a thing. Even like muscle strains can be common in speed climbing. But as far as like major injuries that could hamper your career for several months on end is pretty rare compared to some other sports.
Got it. And I take it you are probably involved in climbing in other disciplines before you started in speed climbing.
Yeah, typically I probably specialized in speed when I was maybe 12 or 13.
hmm. And I mean, so what does your training look like, right? I think when we look at your sport, we sort of think, and this is us being very naive, it looks like very fast bouldering to a certain extent. Um, are there common sort of training aspects between the two sports? Is the training similar?
Yeah, so I would say speed climbing is just like a bunch of bouldering moves really, really fast stacked back together. But also, typically, speed climbers are in the gym way more than boulderers and lead climbers, just because when you're lead climbing, especially, you're on a spray wall. Typically, you're trying to do hard moves that you haven't seen before, so that when they come up either outdoors or in competition, then you can do those moves. Bouldering, you want to get on different types of sets, like someone else can set you a route and you can train on that. But speed, you're really just trying to get objectively faster and more powerful. And so that's your main thing, is you're mostly lifting weights to do that, in order to get into that physical shape to speed climb at a high level.
I imagine, when I think about speed in terms of training, I think of kind of plyometric type stuff, to increase your explosiveness. Is that kind of one of the aspects of your training? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I would say it's a big aspect. My S&C coach would get mad at me if I said it was actually plyometric because of the I think the ground contact time is still a little bit too high to say it's truly plyometric, but
Oh,
I would say that is correct to a, like, even not, I wouldn't even say a layman's eye, but I would even say my eye.
Yeah.
yeah.
And then I would also imagine that the mental training and kind of visualizing the route and visualizing the moves probably plays a pretty important role in your sport as well.
Yeah, I would say it's pretty up there with like maybe shooting or archery, in terms of like the mental preparation, just because the how much you actually play your sport versus how much time you have both training and thinking and dedicating your life to it. It's crazy how much like that difference and how much mental stress that creates, and how it almost then becomes a process of dealing with that stress.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really good point because your execution is so quick, but what people don't understand is sort of the high level and sort of the longevity of the training that it takes to get there. So we come from a spine background, and we had talked earlier, and you had mentioned, like speed climbing is actually a fairly safe sport. What are aspects of that sport that make it so safe in your mind compared to some of these other sports that we see where, muscle strains, back strains, back sprains, even herniated discs are pretty common. I know I didn't see a whole lot of bending, lifting, and twisting during your event, but there's still a lot of reaching and fast movements.
And I think there's probably a lot of core strength involved too, right? That's something that often predisposes people to spine injuries is lack of core strength. And I imagine your core has to be very strong to be able to execute these movements in such a quick and choreographed manner.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, saying, of course, it's relative in terms of other sports. So, like, obviously, there's no contact. It's not a fighting sport. It's not like American football, rugby, things like that. Um, you're not like, generally, when you're moving at fast speeds, even though you're moving super fast for speed climbing, you're not moving that fast in terms of like a runner. So like you couldn't say run into a wall or something like that, like or run in like in trip and fall because you're moving only still a couple meters per second because you're climbing against gravity. So it makes that a little bit safer. But there obviously are still a lot of injuries, like in terms of if you don't do the right things. And I have a very methodical plan to not get injured in terms of both my mobility, what I do outside my nutrition and sleep is probably the biggest part of that. Um, and as far as like, I wouldn't say I do it as an injury prevention measure. I obviously do, but like transferring energy from your like through your posterior chain is probably one of the bigger parts of my sport. So your legs are your main power creators. You're jumping, which you can always jump harder than you can pull, and transferring that energy through your body and through your spinal and your thoracic spine, all those things. Sorry if I'm using the wrong words here. And using that to create power at the most efficient rate while not losing it is probably also the biggest part of my sport, especially at a high level.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the last Olympian that we talked to was actually a sailor, and she talked about how you can only pull ropes, not push ropes, But your comment that you can jump a lot harder than you can pull is really important. That force you generate through your core and through your legs is what drives you up the wall. It's not you pulling yourself up the wall. Although watching your video of your world record, it looked like you were freaking Spider-Man going up that wall. So.
Yeah, I would say I actually could probably get a full number now, but like I would say it's maybe 65-35 in terms of force generated from arms versus legs at this point, just because of the biomechanically, because of the position, since the route is the same and since the route has different points in which your body has to be in. Obviously, sometimes that means it's more emphasis on arms versus on legs.
I see. And then you brought up a really good point about mobility. People talk about that all the time and how important mobility is, especially in sort of the hips and other joints surrounding your back to protect your back and core. What does your mobility work look like? Is it a daily sort of routine? Is it multiple times a day at this point? Is it before your training?
Yeah, so I would say it's multiple times a day. Probably but it's different types of things. So in the morning I'll do some things just to get my body sort of activated. And then post training, a little light stretching routine can help just almost purely as an injury prevention measure. And then at night, I'll also do, or at night, or usually not before I go to bed, but like I'll have a lift typically at night. And that'll be some like active mobility. So maybe some stretches that can improve my mobility, like in terms of on the wall. So stuff like, for example, I struggled a lot with shoulder mobility through the past couple of months just because I'm naturally not great at it. And so exercises like this, where I would push my arm against the floor, and as I would straighten it, it would go sort of into this position, and then several repetitions of that to try and get it to the right place. Another major thing is you want your plantar and dorsiflexors to be as mobile as possible. So certain stretches that improve those and just things like that are probably my biggest examples. But obviously, there's just the whole suite of stuff that isn't too different from a lot of other athletes, I would say.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, underrated thing is work on mobility. I think it's really important in elite athletes like yourself, but I think in a lot of our patients, that they don't spend as much time focusing on mobility and how important that is to be able to kind of generate force through the whole movement of a joint. The last thing I kind of wanted to touch on as we wrap up here is you mentioned the role of nutrition. That's something that we haven't talked a lot about, and you mentioned that in terms of your injury prevention strategy as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for nutrition, I have a diet sort of more so centered around excuse me.
Bless
Um,
you.
sorry. The allergies is not getting me well. Okay, so my diet is sort of centered on I want to keep my main three amino acid levels up pretty much at all times. Not right now because I'm taking a break, but during my training, I'll have stuff that has a lot of protein in it every couple hours so that my leucine, isoleucine, and valine levels are at a constant level throughout the day to maintain and build muscle in some cases. So, and then also my carbohydrate content, just making sure I have enough energy to go to my chest sessions and be as fueled as possible. I think a very common misconception is like with sports like mine, they're like, oh, you don't want to weigh too much. But to be quite honest, it is almost never true that it would be advantageous to cut weight and lose the energy to go to the training session and train harder.
Mhm.
Like I would say, like maybe for 1% of people, that would be the case for my sport, that is. So like I'm a big advocate of like if I'm doing a major session, I'll have like plenty of food or even just like bread with like olive oil and stuff like that so I can be as fueled as possible just because I'll do these long sessions that'll involve like several hours of training on end and then come back for a lift. So that requires a lot of calories for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. We often sort of glance over that when we talk about, especially with spine health, where there's large muscles in play. But Sam, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciated chatting with you. It's really enjoyed sort of learning about a new sport and sort of the intricacies and sort of the power that's generated and how you use that power to sort of fly up a walls, which it looks like. But
Yeah.
yeah, thanks so much for joining us. To everyone out there, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram at The Athlete Spine. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.